All right, well, we're back at it. So these are short answers. Man, the last one I did was the Trinity. That's no biggie, right? So today we're doing creation. I think was the next on my list I posted. If you're on this page, thanks for coming. These are really just supposed to be like kind of fairly quick, ramblings about various theological topics. So creation, that's a simple one, right? No controversy whatsoever. We all just agree on it and we move on, right? Yeah, right. Hang on, let me get this text open here. So a lot of these I'm going to try to stick to just like a few examples in Scripture because I don't want to like jump all over the place on you. Because it's a fairly confusing topic to a lot of people what creation even means. But I'd like to address it from a less abstract perspective in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of times in the West, when we talk about creation, we're talking about kind of this abstract idea of God. Well, okay, here's a good example of it. It's like in the modern age, early modern age, before Darwinism came into vogue, deism was the philosophy du jour of the intellectual, right? So the idea of deism was God made it and then he let it go, right? And he doesn't touch it anymore. And that's actually, Darwinism actually came out of that tradition in a lot of ways, because I do believe Darwin tagged deism on to his theory. So he wasn't even canceling that particular approach to things. It was kind of like later 19th century thinkers who started spearheading that, if I recall correctly, but it's been a while since I studied that specifically. But so Genesis 1 is a totally different approach. And the biblical philosophy of the universe is quite different than the secular West. And the secular West really comes out of Aristotelianism, which, in my opinion, has a more static view of reality than the Bible. And hence this idea of the universe kind of like standing on its own, right? So a lot of like scientific philosophical theories, which I'm going to call them that because they are partially scientific, of like a closed system, for instance, that's based in a more Western philosophical vision of reality. And the funny thing is, how could we ever prove the universe is a closed system? I mean, that's hysterical. Yeah, right. But anyway, so you get to Genesis 1, right? So God created the heavens and the earth. So this notion of God created. And he created the stuff above the earth and the stuff on the earth. So it's all his, right? Because Shemayim, which is the Hebrew word for the heavens, is this notion of all of it, right? That everything that's not earth is like the heavens, right? So it's this massive amount of crap up there. So he made all of it, right? It's all his stuff, okay? But then we get into these questions of like, why did he make it and how did he make it and all those things. And Genesis 1 actually provides us with a lot of information about that, as does the rest of the Bible, in a way that's kind of like easy to miss, actually. It's kind of interesting. But it says that the earth was formless and void, right, which is kind of interesting. So it claims there was like this stuff, right, that God like kind of found almost, or that was already there. So the earth was, and by the way, don't freak out yet, because I'll kind of talk about this a little bit more, but Waharetz Haitha Toho Vabohu, or Tohu Vabohu, Vakoshek al Paneh, Tahom Ruach Elohim Murakafeth al Paneh Hamayim, right? So this idea of there's nothing there and God's hovering over it, which is like hysterical, right? It's like a nothing that he's hovering over. Vayomer Elohim Yehi or Vayehi or. All right, so this idea of, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, okay? Now that right there, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to unpack that, because that tells you about what you need to know about creation right there. And you might say, Kevin, that's crazy, but it's actually quite true. So what's interesting about the way God made this reality is, see, a lot of Christians go into this ex nihilo idea, right? And they say, God was the only thing there, and there was nothing, right? Which is sort of interesting. But actually, if you study the whole trajectory of Scripture, it has a more complex philosophy of nothingness, right? So nothingness in the Bible is not necessarily empty space or no space. It's actually that which is not established by the deity is nothing, right? So if you went through and you kind of like studied this idea of nothingness, like a primary example of nothingness in Scripture would be death, right? Death is a state of de-existence in Scripture. But what's fascinating about it is Jesus talks about what? People being around after they're dead, right? So there's a nothing and a something at the same time, which seems like a paradox. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? So there's this paradoxical tension, and you see it even in Genesis 1, right? That stuff's already there. And in most primeval mythologies, there's a sea dragon already there, Tiamat, right? For instance, in Enuma Elish. And in the Bible, it's Tehom, right? Which is a very similar word. The depths. Tiamat, Tehom, similar words, the depths, right? There's just this watery nothing, right? There's nothing there, but there's something, right? Which we get kind of confused by. And it's formless and void, but for something to be formless and void, there's got to be something, right? So there's this kind of like primeval chaos stuff. And I really think, here's how I approach this. So God is the source of life, and life is God giving you what he is. He's alive, he's something, he has existence. If you receive existence, you receive it from him, right? And that's not pantheism, by the way. It means he basically loans his life to you, right? So he took this Tehom nothing, right, and he made it something, and he formed the universe out of this stuff that had no existence otherwise. And Earth is actually the core of that Tehom story, because Earth is actually modeled, I believe, on Yahweh's his delight in Tehom. And actually, if you study all these different mythological systems going on in Scripture, and don't take that as meaning they're not true. I mean more like they're the stories of reality, right? Which is more what like a myth is. It's a narrative way of explaining reality. That's what a myth is. These myths in the Bible, or you find Tehom keeps coming up. This image of primeval chaos embodied in like water keeps coming up, right? It's all over the Bible. And so you're going to find, as you study the Bible, if you notice that, Genesis 1, you find that everywhere, right? So actually what's kind of interesting is Thales, who was a Greek philosopher who said the earth is made out of water, was actually kind of right. I mean, that's what God made it out of, was water. And that's why when you get up into space, you like float around and stuff, right? You're just floating, right? It's like water up there. And people might say, well, that's not the actual atomic structure of water, but you know what? My thing about that is, what the hell do we even know about that? Yeah, okay, like nothing, right? I keep finding out how little we know about atoms and stuff. We're still looking for that God particle. One of these days we'll find it, don't worry. I think it's going to like loop around and we'll like come back and we'll be looking at our own heads or something, but yeah, whatever. So what this means then is God, he is the one who creates out of things that are nothing. He creates, right? And when he creates, he gives life, he forms it, he organizes it, he makes it something. And without him, nothing is anything at all. Nothing exists. And that's an interesting thing about metaphysics in Scripture, which I will have a metaphysics section. God's the only thing that makes you real. Without him, you just devolve into nothing. Even though you might still be there, you're technically nothing because you don't have God. And you can exist in this sort of like quasi-nothingness state, but you're nothing, right? And that's actually kind of what hell is. It's eternal existence as nothing, right? Because he cuts you off from his life permanently. And, you know, that's... So in Genesis 1, he takes Tehom and he forms it, right? And by the way, did he have to do it that way? Oh, no, right? I mean, God can do whatever he wants. And we know nothing outside of this reality, right? And we don't really know much about eternity. But what we do know is this particular reality is formed off of this Tehom idea. And beyond that, we really don't know anything about it. And it's best not to speculate too much about that stuff, because what reality looks like outside of a time situation is quite complicated. And in my opinion, time is actually God writing a narrative that's structured, right? So, but yet has freedom. Like, so it flows in a specific way because God is limiting it. But once we enter the eighth day, who even knows? I mean, that's a whole other ball of wax. So anyway, so God took this chaos, gave it existence, right, which it doesn't have apart from him. So, I mean, in a way, Christian existentialists, in my opinion, are correct about that. Makes it something and forms it, right? And all of a sudden, life flows out of this thing, right, which God gives it, right? And he creates the life and he structures it and it becomes this thing, right? which is actually pretty cool, but it's created. See, and that's the difference between God and the stuff. He just exists in and of himself. You can't beat that guy. He's indomitable. He just is, right? That's his name, Yahweh, the guy who is, right? And the Greeks translated that ha'on, the being one, right? What do we even do with a guy like that? He just is, right? You either love him or get over it. He is. You can't beat him, right? And that's how Revelation talks about the end of time. They come to get Yahweh and he sneezes on him and everybody dies, right? I mean, that's God, right? You can't beat God, right? It's hysterical that people try. But anyway, so that's creation is really, in my opinion, it's this idea of God gives life, right? So you're nothing without him. And to whom was just this dead, chaotic nothing, right? There's just nothing to it. And what's fascinating is humans chose to return to that in their rebellion. They wanted to go back to nothing. So God's created this kind of like quasi-rebellious reality where people can choose to do that. But seeing as he is reality, right? When you do that, you revert to nothing, right? So that's really how I view Genesis 1. And if you want to talk more about that, email me. I know it's not traditionally how we think of it, but I would contend that's because we view reality in statics, and the Bible views the reality in dynamics, right? So stasis is something just stands on its own, right? And that's how Westerners think, right? Hence this idea of a closed system, for example, right? Or even like mass, right? We have this idea of things just having mass, and that's actually not like biblical. Not that you shouldn't use that equation or anything, just that's not how the Bible exactly looks at that matter. Which actually it's all masses, it's an equation, right? It's just like ratios, right? That's all a lot of this stuff is. It's ratio sets that you can use to kind of regulate and study things. Quite useful in a lot of regards, actually. The universe is largely built on mathematics. Of course, I'm wandering in my thoughts here. But anyway, so just that's kind of how the Bible views the idea of creation. And that's actually kind of interesting. So when you get into these evolutionary debates, which I'll have a video on that specific topic, my main contention against evolution is not that God couldn't do that, but that many of its bases are not biblical, and how God actually views metaphysics. So that's one of the issues with that particular way of viewing things. That, and I also believe it's a temple of Dagon. It's actually it's turning what I call man logic into a religion, which fallen men, we'll get into that in a different video, but I think it's really how men look at the world, not how God does. Although, there's stuff you can find that sort of indicates it, but I think it has more to do with the way God's directed history than how we're looking at it, which is sort of interesting. You can justify that argument pretty easily, actually. Okay, well, that's creation. I went 13 minutes. Sorry, I said in the first one they'd be like 5. Let me know if you have any other questions. I'm going to keep posting these. Let me know if they're useful. So, all right, God bless.